Kaiser 6-1, hello.
You guys coming in for the game tomorrow?
Affirm.
So it would be bad if I said go Raptors? Kaiser 6-1 to send to 3,000.
3,000, Kaiser 6-1.
I can give you a short final if you can hook me up with one of the games.
Sure.
What?
Yeah, I wish.
I figured so. It's worth a shot, though.
Always.
It's always worth a shot. And you just heard an air traffic controller in Toronto negotiating for basketball tickets with the pilot who was bringing the Oakland, California's Golden State Warriors basketball team into Toronto for the NBA playoff games. Now, next time, I'm betting she gives that guy a holding pattern. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. And today we're talking about the details of what appears to be an icing-related accident that claimed the lives of a client of mine and his wife when their SR22 crashed in Utah 2 weeks ago. Hopefully you'll learn one or two things that you didn't already know about icing that could help save your life in the future. Now, last week in episode 110, we talked with UND Associate Professor Fred Reamer about icing, so if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. Coming up this week in the news, a designated medical examiner is facing prison time, and we'll tell you what he did, or rather what he didn't do. And Buy Aerospace gets a huge order for their electric airplanes from a brand new company that wants them for a rather interesting new business. All this and more, and the news starts now. From warbirdsnews.com, D-Day plus 75 years. Yes, it's the 75th anniversary of D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord. And to celebrate that, there was a huge flyover over the beachheads and landing zones of Normandy, France, on June 6th, celebrating the original invasion from 1944. A fleet of World War II transport aircraft, predominantly Douglas C-47s, but also some modern aircraft from the militaries of both France and the United States, formed the Aerial Armada, which also paid respects to the dead with a trip past World War II cemeteries along the route. A smaller ceremony also took place in Portsmouth, England, home of the Royal Navy, and one of the primary locations from which more than 1,000 British and American naval vessels set forth on June 5th, 1944 for Operation Neptune, the marine component of Overlord, which was the assault on Nazi-occupied France. More than 30 Douglas C-47s were scheduled to take part in the flyover this past week, with 15 of them being part of the D-Day squadron, which we've been following along their epic journey from the United States to Europe over the past 3 weeks. Now, the previous day, a number of Douglas transport aircraft dropped 200 or so reenactors in vintage-styled World War II costumes and parachutes nearby one of the original drop zones. Now, one of these people who made the drop was 97-year-old Tom Rice of San Diego, California, recreating a more peaceful version of the same jump he made on the same soil in 1944. It's been an emotional few days of marking arguably the single most important event of the past century, where the free peoples of the world joined together in a singular endeavor to crush the Nazi Empire. While many of the aircraft which took place in these celebrations will likely fly on for decades to come, it's unlikely that many of their former passengers and flight crews have many more years, and that's part of why we're remembering them this week. From FlyingMag.com, Blackbird places an order for 100 Buy Aerospace electric aircraft. Blackbird, an online air charter broker that has visions of becoming an Uber for the skies, has placed an order with Buy Aerospace for more than 100 electric airplanes that it says will one day make flying more affordable than driving for trips up to 300 miles. Buy Aerospace announced that Blackbird has agreed to purchase its first 100 four-seat E-Flyer 4 electric airplanes and will also purchase 10 of Buy's E-Flyer 2 planes. Price for the E-Flyer 4, $449,000. Blackbird says it plans to offer flights aboard the electric-powered airplanes from a number of California airports and possibly on the East Coast as well, where Blackbird currently offers charter flight bundles in the New York City area through its app. According to its website, Blackbird is an air travel matchmaking service connecting pilots and airplanes with paying passengers. It is unclear at this point whether Blackbird would operate the E-Flyer fleet itself or contract with a third party, nor is it known where the seed money to launch this new stage of the business will come from. We're still likely a few years away from the E-Flyers 4 FAA certification. These details are likely to be made public well before the launch of Blackbird's new commercial electric-powered air service. And full disclosure here, I think that I actually gave a ride to some people from Blackbird so that they could take photographs from the air in the local area here in a Cirrus. So I may be in the background of some of those pictures. I'm not sure. So check out their website if you want. From mynews13.com, a Port Orange doctor in Florida okayed pilots who didn't meet FAA rules. A Port Orange doctor faces more than $440,000 in penalties for clearing people to fly airplanes without performing examinations that met FAA guidelines for first-class medical certificates. Federal records allege that Dr. Curley examined patients in the Spruce Creek flying community near Port Orange, which, by the way, is in the vicinity of Daytona Beach on the Atlantic coast, and acknowledged that 75% of the people he approved didn't meet FAA guidelines, but he signed off on them anyway. As a result, federal investigators allege that Dr. Curley improperly earned $392,000. He's agreed to cut a check for that amount under a proposed plea deal with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida. He's also agreed to pay $48,818 to reimburse the FAA to retest pilots who improperly received medical approvals from him, according to the proposed agreement. The ophthalmologist has no known disciplinary or public complaints, according to the Florida Department of Health. A proposed plea agreement filed the same day alleges that he issued medical certificates to people who didn't pass important parts of the exam from January 1st, 2017 through February 28th, 2019. During that period, he performed 3,814 medical exams, including 1,101 EKGs. After an investigation by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General and the FBI, undercover agents were dispatched to undergo examinations by Curley. In all three exams, according to records, the doctor failed to measure applicants' height, examine their eyes, study their abdomens, examine their extremities or spines, ask applicants about body scars, marks, or tattoos, perform neurologic, lymphatic, or psychiatric screening. The proposed plea agreement calls for Curley to plead guilty to each of the three counts of making false statements to the government. The maximum penalty for each charge is 5 years in prison. The proposed plea agreement includes a request to consider his cooperation when deciding whether to impose prison time, but it doesn't offer no prison guarantee, and he has to accept whatever prison time is imposed. From AOPA.org, Sebring cancels its U.S. Sport Aviation Expo. The annual U.S. Sport Aviation Expo, hosted at Florida's Sebring Regional Airport since 2003, has been canceled. A farewell message posted on the official website thanked attendees for 15 incredible years after the January 2020 event was scrubbed. Quote, "The U.S. Sport Expo has done a good job with its original mission," said U.S. Sport Aviation Expo program manager Janice Rurick, who explained that the airport would instead focus on youth and growing the future of aviation. Quote, "It became very clear that after 15 years, the light sport platform had its own legs, while at the same time the drone industry gained momentum. The Sebring event has grown in popularity since light sport aircraft burst onto the scene in the early 2000s, with hopes to provide pilots with a low-cost pathway to the sky through smaller aircraft and alternative licensing regulations." Dan Johnson, a light sport aviation expert, wrote on his website that the first expo was held barely a month after the FAA announced the new airplane and pilot certificate category. He said the LSA community embraced Sebring enthusiastically as dozens of new aircraft were introduced into an exceedingly crowded field. The light sport market has since seen its share of manufacturers fall by the wayside. In 2016, the DeLand Sport Aviation Showcase, also in Florida, began to compete in the same market with a similar format. The show takes place in November and siphoned off pilot interest and some of the category's mainstays. From InsideIndianaBusiness.com, Red Bull discontinues its Air Race World Championships. The Red Bull Air Race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, originally scheduled for October, has been canceled as a result of Red Bull's decision to discontinue the Air Race World Championship following the 2019 season. The company says the races scheduled between June and September in Russia, Hungary, and Japan will run as planned. Since its inception in 2013, there have been more than 90 races with a Red Bull Air Race. At its inaugural race at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in 2016, the event attracted more than 62,000 fans. The company said the races, quote, "did not attract the level of outside interest as many other Red Bull events around the world." IMS President Doug Bowles made the following statement about the cancellation of this year's event at the Speedway. Quote, "We were informed this morning by management of the Red Bull Air Race organization that the 2019 championship will be suspended after September and that this year's round at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, scheduled for October 19th to 20th, is canceled. We're disappointed that we will not host another Red Bull Air Race event, and I know many of our fans will be disappointed as well. We enjoyed watching the pilots navigate the unique course over the Indianapolis Motor Speedway grounds, and we were especially excited to see American pilot Michael Goulian celebrate a well-earned victory last year. Customers who already purchased tickets will receive refunds. They will receive an email later with information on that process." Now, one other contributing factor, I think, to the demise, which is very sad to hear, is that there was a 3-year hiatus of the Red Bull Air races. and after the races were restarted, they never seemed to be able to attract quite the same size audiences that they had previously. So, farewell Red Bull races. From AOPA.org, ForeFlight provides takeoff and landing performance data. ForeFlight now provides detailed takeoff and landing performance data for its top-tier subscribers. ForeFlight makes these instant calculations for about 200 models of singles, twins, and turboprops. The popular app has the ability to account for weather, wind, and runway condition and orientation along a pilot's entire route of flight. It even makes estimates based on forecast conditions at the estimated time of arrival. Before takeoff, ForeFlight automatically calculates ground roll, accelerates stop distance, climb rate, and gradient, and other measures. Before landing, it figures reference airspeed, landing distance over a 50-foot obstacle, ground roll, and other measures dealing with possible go-arounds. If a runway is too short or a twin single-engine climb performance is inadequate, ForeFlight highlights these areas of concern before a pilot takes off or attempts a landing. ForeFlight only supplies this takeoff and landing performance calculations for its $300 a year Performance Plus and Business Performance subscribers. From kitplanes.com, Garmin adds the latest FISB weather products to the GTN 650-750 Navigator series. Garmin announced several new enhancements and the addition of new features within the GTN 650-750 series of touchscreen navigators. With the latest software update and a compatible ADS-B receiver, pilots can now view new FISB weather products on the GTNs. When paired with a compatible ADS-B product, pilots can now access the latest FISB weather products on the moving map alongside flight plan information and dedicated weather pages within the GTN 650-750. These new weather products include lightning, cloud tops, turbulence, icing, both the current and forecasted icing, graphical airmets, and Weather Center Advisories, or CWAs. This adds to the growing number of Garmin products that already support these new weather products, including Garmin Pilot on Apple mobile devices, G3X Touch, and the Era 660 Aviation Portable. And for customers with SiriusXM Aviation Weather, pilots now have the option to alternate between base reflectivity and composite reflectivity for next-rad weather radar imagery. Pilots operating into airports throughout the world that are not served by SBAS can now receive advisory vertical guidance such as LNAV plus V while flying LNAV approaches with the GTN 650-750. In international news from avweb.com, US ADS-B won't work in Canada. USGA operators may not be able to fly in some Canadian-controlled airspace and vice versa when ADS-B is fully implemented, according to NAV Canada. The not-for-profit corporation is also a major investor in Aireon, that's A-I-R-E-O-N, a recently activated space-based ADS-B tracking system that requires ADS-B 1090ES transmitters with antennas on the top of the aircraft to be properly tracked. Now, the U.S. uses a ground-based system that requires belly-mounted antennas. Aireon has tested belly-mounted antennas with its system, and they don't meet performance requirements necessary for IFR separation. NAV Canada is telling Canadian pilots that its system will be exclusively based on the satellite system, and they should be making their equipage decisions accordingly. In most cases, it's not as simple as adding a second antenna to be able to fly in controlled airspace in both countries, as only a few ADS-B systems offer the so-called antenna diversity ability. Now, NAV Canada doesn't make the rules in Canada, but in this case, the first two phases of implementation, which will affect airspace at 12,500 feet and above, can be done through airspace changes. In a letter to a Canadian pilot who inquired about his ADS-B options, the NAV Canada spokesperson who responded told him the third phase of implementation, which will cover all or part of the controlled airspace commonly used by GA, could be in effect as soon as 2023. Now, Aireon system uses transponders on a constellation of 66 low Earth orbit Iridium satellites and can track any properly equipped aircraft anywhere in the world within seconds. And finally, from our Dumb Pilot Tricks file, a story from Galesburg.com. Oregon pilot pleads guilty to, you guessed it, a federal drug case. An Oregon pilot pleaded guilty last week in federal court for bringing 200 pounds of cannabis into Illinois and landing at the Monmouth Airport in December 2017. Sean Billingsley, 32, of Jacksonville, Oregon, pleaded guilty May 23rd to federal counts of possession with the intent to distribute at least 50 kilograms of marijuana and having a firearm in the furtherance of a drug trafficking crime. Online federal court records indicate Billingsley chose to enter a plea of guilty last month and did so last week again in the U.S. District Courthouse in Davenport. He was arrested on December 12, 2017 by Monmouth Police along with the Warren County Sheriff's Office and the West Illinois Central Task Force. That arrest occurred after authorities responded to the airport and found Billingsley unloading duffel bags from an airplane. About 200 pounds of cannabis was found in the bags, along with $2,830 and a pistol on the Oregon man's person. He was then federally indicted in February 2018 and is represented by attorney Dan Dalton, who elected not to pursue a motion to suppress evidence that was filed by a federal public defender who initially represented Billingsley in federal court. The 1963 Cessna 210C that Billingsley flew to Monmouth was auctioned off last summer by Monmouth authorities as a result of drug forfeiture proceedings in Warren County Court. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, my weekly updates. And then we're on to our main topic about an SR22 Icing-related accident in tailplane stalls. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Here are a few quick updates. I just saw this morning a new podcast episode from Brandon, who does the Podcasting on a Plane podcast. He's a controller. He alerted me to an announcement that's on the FAA's website that says a new hiring window is just about to open for entry-level air traffic controller positions. And by the way, no experience required on this particular round of hiring. It's a very short window, June 14th through the 17th, and they may actually close the hiring window if they get too many job applications. So you want to make sure that yours goes in at the beginning of the hiring window, June 14th. Don't wait till the 17th to do it. And you do, of course, have to meet a number of minimum requirements. I'll mention a couple of them, but you want to go out to the website and take a look. For example, you must be a U.S. citizen. You cannot have turned age 31 by the time you apply. You have to pass a medical, pass a security investigation, pass a pre-employment test for the FAA, speak English clearly enough to be understood, and have 3 years of progressive responsible work experience or a bachelor's degree or a combination of post-secondary education and work experience that totals 3 years, and you have to be willing to relocate to whatever FAA facility they need your help at. You can find all the information out at faa.usajobs.gov, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And a quick shout out to EAA Chapter 20 and a big thank you and tip of the hat to Oliver Coolidge. He mentioned Aviation News Talk podcast in their most recent newsletter. And I went out to their website, which you can find at eaa20.org. If you happen to be anywhere near the San Carlos Airport in Northern California, you may want to check them out. I was reading about their RV-12 project. They've got a group of people there who are building an RV-12, and they're looking for some additional people to buy into that project. It's pretty low cost buy-in. So if you've got any interest in owning a share of an RV-12 and a chance to help build it, you'll want to check out that website. Also, they've got a fundraising project for Project Tin Goose. Now, that's the $1 million project to put new wings on the EAA Ford Trimotor, which they're looking to do over the next year. And this chapter is going to hold a fundraiser to raise money for that project. They've also got scholarships and all kinds of other things, so check them out at eaa20.org. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Jonathan Fink. He wanted to let you know about his website, where'smyairport.com. Pretty cool. If you've ever been in the situation where you're trying to figure out which GA airport is going to be closest to a particular place I want to go to, this website answers that question. So, for example, people are often asking me, hey, I want to fly into a Giants game at Pac Bell Park in San Francisco. Is it better to go to San Carlos Airport or Oakland? Well, this lets you just basically type in the words Pac Bell Park, click on search, and then it's going to show the drive times from all those different airports. So pretty handy site. Check that out at where'smyairport.com. By the way, don't put www in front of it. I tried that, and it didn't work for me. And again, I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And a few days ago, I finished up an Embark training. That's the 3 free days of training that Cirrus provides when people buy used aircraft. And that was with Brooks Evans down at the San Martin Airport. He bought a 2011 SR22T. And while Brooks and I were flying around, we popped into the King City Airport and we overheard another aircraft in the pattern, which was a Pipistrel Cetus, being flown by a very young lady, based on the voice anyway. We didn't know who she was at the time. But he just sent me a link to an article that was posted by Scott Dennstaedt, who we'll have on later in this show. And Scott writes on the cirruspilots.org website, which is the COPA website, that a very bright young lady by the name of Riley Spidell just turned 14 and will be flying solo in her powered glider across the country from California to Maine over a 9-day period. She got connected to me through her father, who is a CFI glider instructor who will be following her in another airplane along the way. Her dad had purchased my weather book and reached out to me for help with her trip. So I went out to the YouTube channel and also her Instagram account, and that's where I learned that she just soloed on June the 3rd, I believe, which was her birthday, and she's about to leave now any day on this trip across the country. So I'll put links in the show notes here to her YouTube channel and also Instagram so you can follow along as well. Now, here's something that I don't run across too often, but I thought I would share with you because I haven't seen it anywhere else. This was told to me by a friend of mine who works in law enforcement locally, and she said that she had seen on one of the summaries of crimes in the area that there were some stolen radios taken from an aircraft at the Watts Woodland Airport in Woodland, California. And it said basically this: on May the 12th, 2019, there were 2 instances of stolen radios. In both cases, the planes were locked. The suspects broke the latch to the door and each removed the plane's navigation communication system worth about $15,000. Now, I remember a spate of those probably 20 years ago where crooks would fly into local airports at night and do that. I did some searching, and the only other story I could find was a year ago, which occurred at the Mansfield, Massachusetts airport, where essentially the same thing happened. So just be aware there's some folks out there who are stealing radios. And as you probably already know, I'll be speaking at the AOPA fly-in at the Livermore Airport. That's going to be on Friday and Saturday, June the 21st and the 22nd. So come check that out. One of those will be on my San Francisco Bay Tour seminar. Also, I have the Bay Tour maps for sale there. And on Saturday, I'll be doing my 3-hour advanced IFR presentation. And also, I'm going to try and set up a place for Aviation News Talk listeners to meet up. So we'll let you know more about that. Also, I'm going to be in Chicago on Wednesday, June the 26th, speaking at the Chicago Executive Pilots Association. That will be on night flying. Now, let me tell you briefly a couple ways that you can help support the show. And if you've ever thought about supporting the show, now would be a great time to do that. I try to add a few supporters every month because we lose a few every month, and we lost more this month, I think, than ever before, and all because people's credit cards expired and they didn't go in and correct those. So if you'd like to join us, there are a couple ways to do that. In the past, I've had folks ask if there were other ways that they could donate rather than Patreon, and I've set up a new location where you can do that on PayPal. So if you'd like to send us a one-time contribution or regular monthly contributions from your credit card, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and you'll be able to do that. Also want to thank folks who are supporting us through Patreon, and those who do that can get a few extra goodies. So, for example, our $4 a month supporters get copies of the scripts for each of our news shows, and the $8 a month supporters get scripts plus the links to all the stories that we didn't cover in the news because of time constraints. And this week, we had 18 stories that didn't make it into the news and are in that listing. Also, we have a number of super supporters who donate more than $20 a month, and we want to thank all of those as well. And here are our latest Patreon supporters. They include Bruce Estes, John Cummings, Catherine Cavagnaro, and Vic Bajaj. So thanks so much to all of you for supporting the show, and thanks to everyone who supports the show in any way, whether you do that by sending us emails, listener questions, or leaving reviews on the podcast app that you are listening to. And now in a moment, we're going to be talking about our main topic, which is the icing-related accident in the SR22 and how tailplane stalls can be quite deadly in icing. All that right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. Well, yesterday I went to the memorial service of my client who died 2 weeks ago in what appears to be an icing accident over Utah. So I wanted to finish out the conversation we started last week when we spoke with Professor Dale Reamer about icing in general. Now I'd like to talk about the specifics of this accident. And I'm sure there's some listeners out there who may think, oh, we should never speculate about the cause of an accident until we get the final NTSB report. But as longtime listeners know, I disagree with that philosophy for several reasons. The first is that people are 10 times more interested in accidents when they happen than they are 18 months later when the final report is released. And second, even if everything I tell you right now were to turn out in 18 months to be completely wrong, I'm still going to be talking today about the same kinds of mechanisms that have led to other fatal icing accidents. And I think there's a lot you can learn now about icing. Certainly, I've learned a few critical things I didn't know over the past couple of weeks as I've tried to understand this accident. For example, a lot of people have wondered why the cap's parachute didn't save this pilot, and I think I now know the answer, which I'll share with you. Coincidentally, the preliminary NTSB report was just released, so I'm going to read portions of that to you now, and I'll include a link to it in the show notes. The location was Grover, Utah, on May 24th, 2019 at 11:22 Mountain Daylight Time. Cirrus SR22, 2 fatal injuries. On May the 24th, about 11:22 Mountain Daylight Time, a Cirrus SR22 impacted terrain about 6 miles southeast of Grover, Utah. The private pilot and passenger were fatally injured, and the airplane was destroyed. VMC conditions prevailed in the vicinity of the accident site, and the flight was operated on an IFR flight plan. The flight departed Canyonlands Field Airport, that's CNY, at Moab, Utah, about 10:42 and was destined for the Henderson Executive Airport, HND, in Las Vegas. Witnesses reported that they heard the airplane, and when they looked up, they observed it nose down, descending like a corkscrew. The airplane descended behind a hillside. Shortly thereafter, they heard an explosion and saw smoke rise from the area. At 10:55, the Hanksville Airport, HVE, in Hanksville, Utah, located about 30 miles northeast of the accident site, reported winds from 170 at 6, clear skies, 10 statute miles visibility, temperature 15, dew point 2, and an altimeter setting of 30.05. A high-resolution rapid refresh numerical model over the accident site depicted a freezing level at 9,755 feet and supported broken to overcast clouds with bases near 3,300 feet AGL and tops to 15,000 feet. The airplane was removed to a secure location for further examination. That's the end of the report. First, let me tell you a little bit more about the aircraft, which I had spent hundreds of hours teaching in over the last 10 years. It was a 2006 normally aspirated SR22. It had a TKS system, but not the newer Fiki TKS system, which permits flight into known icing conditions. Now, we'll talk about the differences between TKS and Fiki in a few minutes. Also, the aircraft was not equipped with oxygen, and it's possible the pilot had a portable oxygen bottle with him, but I don't recall him ever mentioning having one, which is possibly why he was flying at 14,000 feet, because at that time he was flying along Victor 8 in Utah, which has an MEA of 13,300 feet. Now, legally, as you know, the oxygen rules permit a pilot to be at 14,000 feet for up to 30 minutes, and I'm guessing the pilot chose 14,000 because he couldn't legally fly any higher than that, and being limited to 14,000 feet later became a problem for him. Now, at catherinesreport.com, they posted 3 photos from the accident site that were taken by the Sheriff's Department, and the plane was almost entirely consumed by fire. When you look at the photo, there's so little left that pile of burned rubble isn't even recognizable as an aircraft. Now, there is a data logger in these aircraft, but I think it's unlikely they'll be able to recover any data from it just because of the severity of the fire. And if they do, we'll know more about that when the final report is published. But we do have flight data available from flightaware.com, so let me describe to you what that shows about the flight, and I've included a link to the flight track in the show notes so you can look at it too if you'd like. The field elevation at KCNY, where he departed, is 4,590 feet. The first data point's at 9:40 a.m. at 5,100 feet, and it shows the aircraft climbing at about 500 feet per minute, slowing to maybe 400 feet per minute as it passes through about 11,300 feet, but otherwise, it's a fairly steady climb until they reach 13,800 feet until about 20 minutes after takeoff. Now, most likely the plane was actually at 14,000 feet, but the ADSB data in this case showed it 200 feet lower. In the climb, the ground speed was around 130 knots. After they leveled off at 14,000 feet, the plane accelerated to around 165 knots, and that speed stayed constant for the first 11 minutes of cruise. But then over the next 3 minutes, the aircraft decelerated to a ground speed of just 87 knots, and so it lost over 60 knots of airspeed in 3 minutes. At the same time, the aircraft climbed a mere 600 feet, so it had an average climb rate of about 200 feet per minute over those last 3 minutes. And then the data just stops. I mean, there's just nothing, which suggests that either something catastrophic happened and the transponder lost electricity, or more likely that the aircraft descended so suddenly and so rapidly that they quickly dropped below whatever altitude the ADSB out could be received in this area of Utah. Now, the terrain was relatively flat, with peaks averaging 5,000 to 6,000 feet for most of the trip, but for the last 15 miles, the terrain rose to 8,500 feet, and then at the crash site, the aircraft had just started to fly over a steep range of mountains that ran below and parallel to Victor 8 and had multiple peaks just over 11,300 feet. Now, you probably know that MEAs in mountainous areas have to be 2,000 feet above the terrain And sure enough, the MEA for Victor 8 was 13,300 or 2,000 feet above the mountains that started just at the crash site. Now, the fact that the aircraft was level for 10 minutes without a speed change suggested to me that the aircraft was on top of the clouds for the first 10 or 11 minutes of the flight in cruise at 14,000 feet. But since it slowed so rapidly over the next 3 minutes, I felt that the aircraft must have entered a cloud, encountered severe icing, and began to slow rapidly as it accumulated ice in the airframe. So I asked meteorologist Scott Dennstaedt to look at the weather at the time of the crash, and he could see from looking at the satellite infrared images a very large cloud in the vicinity of the crash site that rose higher than the surrounding clouds, and he estimated that it went up to 17,000 feet. Now, my icing hypothesis was pretty much confirmed by a listener to this show, and I want to thank Dave, who phoned me a week ago after he heard me talk briefly about this incident in episode 110. Dave was flying along the very same route along Victor 8, and he thinks he was about 60 miles behind the accident pilots, which would be probably about 20 minutes. I've looked at the flight-aware tracks for both flights, and indeed, they perfectly match up in the vicinity of the crash site. Dave says that he flew along at 14,000 feet for some time, but then the cloud tops rose and he was in and out of the tops of the clouds. But then he went into a higher cloud that, based on what he could see beforehand, he thought he passed through very quickly. Now, that turned out not to be the case, and he started picking up ice in the cloud. Now, you may recall that in episode 110, I said that often when I enter a cloud, I'm in it much longer than I thought I would be, and apparently that was the case with this higher cloud that Dave entered. Initially, he noticed some light rime ice, but he wasn't concerned. But when he looked about 5 minutes later, he was shocked to see that he'd already picked up a quarter inch of clear ice that was also running back on the wings. He told me that he'd been running the FIKI system on the max setting, which is 4 times the normal setting, but he was still accumulating ice. So he requested to climb to 16,000 feet, but initially he was only allowed to climb to 15,000 feet, where he noticed the ice no longer accumulated quite as rapidly. Salt Lake Center also asked him to make a radio call to my client as they were now searching for the missing aircraft. Dave mentioned that other airliners were also asked to call, but none of them got any response. Later, Dave was cleared to climb to 16,000 feet, where once again he was able to get back on top of the clouds. Now, the big difference is that Dave has a turbocharged SR22 with built-in oxygen and a FIKI system, so there were no issues with him being able to climb up through the ice, unlike our accident pilot who had a normally aspirated aircraft without FIKI and who most likely didn't have a portable oxygen bottle. And here's a key thing to know. Even FIKI aircraft are not designed to remain in icing, especially moderate and severe icing. Essentially, the Cirrus FIKI system should be on when you climb up through the ice and then off when you're in cruise above the clouds. Later, you'll turn it back on as you descend through the ice and the clouds. As one Cirrus employee told me a while back, he never takes off on a trip unless he's 100% sure that he'll be able to get on top of the clouds. If there's any chance that he'll still be in cloud at the maximum cruise altitude of 25,000 feet, he cancels the trip and doesn't go. So even if you have FIKI, the intent is it uses the system as you're transitioning through ice and not that you continue to fly level in icing at your cruise altitude. I'll talk more about TKS and FIKI and the differences between them, how this aircraft likely stalled, and why the CAPS parachute may not have been much use later in the show. But first, I want to bring in Scott Dennstaedt to talk about what he learned by studying the weather for that day in Utah. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Scott Dennstaedt. Scott is a former National Weather Service research meteorologist and a CFI. And for nearly 20 years, he's been teaching pilots how to minimize their exposure to adverse weather, and he's written over 150 magazine articles. Now, you may recall we talked with Scott in episode 73 about his weather sport app, and later in episode 92, we talked about a new book he's co-authored called Pilot Weather, From Solo to the Airlines. Well, Scott, welcome back to the Aviation News Talk podcast. I'm always happy to have you here on the show.
It's great to be back again, Max. Thanks.
Well, I wish we were here under happier circumstances, but you were one of the first people I turned to 2 weeks ago when I learned that a client of mine had crashed in his SR22 in Utah in what looked to me at the time like an icing-related accident. If you would, please walk us through what the weather was like that day and what the pilot was facing as he was flying along at 14,000 feet.
Sure, I can certainly give that a try. It's tough to really conclude anything at this point in time. Obviously, the NTSB is going to take a look at this and find out exactly what the cause was. But I'm always interested in accidents, especially those in small general aviation airplanes, just because I try to keep people away from this kind of weather. And what I noticed in this particular situation was it wasn't really, say, the usual icing accident we see. It wasn't freezing rain. It wasn't anything to do with any major weather system. In fact, the weather was pretty benign overall in terms of, no frontal systems nearby. There was just this big kind of very benign but sprawling upper level trough over the entire area. And what you have to understand with respect to upper level troughs is that you get kind of you get warm air near the surface and you get that cold pull of air aloft, and that produces a lot of instability. So it's easy sometimes for cumuliform clouds to grow in that kind of environment. And there was no frontal system to lift air. It was just all due to basic instability. And so I looked at the pilot's track along the route, and what I noticed, I usually go right to the infrared satellite imagery, and especially the color enhanced one that has all the reds and blues and greens. It really gives you a good indication of what was happening at this particular time. And that is, I noticed there was some really rapidly developing clouds in that particular area. Specifically, the tops of the clouds were around a temperature of about minus 12, minus 15. And that's really important because when you start getting into those warmer sub-freezing temperatures, the cloud below is dominated by liquid water. There's very little in the way of ice crystals mixed in. So whatever ice you do pick up if you enter those clouds is going to be probably clear. It's going to tend to hit the leading edge and kind of run back. And if an aircraft has a boot on it, for instance, you can't really remove stuff that's run back and frozen behind the leading edges where the boots are. In this particular aircraft, I understand they had TKS, so that may help. But again, if you're not operating the aircraft properly in terms of the speeds and such with respect to TKS, you won't get a good coverage over the wings. So this was a real case where it appears like they were trying to potentially climb over some building cumulus clouds. And cumulus are really problematic in that they can actually climb faster than a small airplane like this, especially one that doesn't have any turbocharging on it. And in the end, with a 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 foot per minute rate of climb of these clouds, it's really hard to get over that. And when you're in the teen levels where your airplane is not going to perform very well anyway, that's really problematic. So you're never going to outclimb these things. And you're in the mountainous areas to some degree here. So we're in a situation where it's hard to think about going low, because if you're IFR, you're in a situation where you may be scraping the mountaintops too. The best kind of action with these things is just don't go into these clouds. Turn around or try to deviate left or right around this thing. But it was a pretty large size area of building cumulus. And I just suspect that he tried to outclimb it or tried to get through this area of building clouds and got himself into some trouble.
When I look at the route, it looks to me for the first half hour or so, he was flying over terrain that was relatively constant between 5,000, 6,000 feet. But for about the last 15 miles before the crash site, the terrain was rising up 7,000, 8,000 feet. And his course actually toward the end of the flight there was just beginning to parallel a string of peaks for 30 miles that topped over 11,000 feet. Now, the tops there, the peaks went up to about 11,300. The MEA for Victor 8 is 13,300, so 2,000 feet above that. Tell us how the rising terrain and kind of flying parallel to a ridge of mountains could make things worse.
It's not unusual to see in certain situations for these development areas, whether you want to call them deep convection or even thunderstorms, tend to develop a lot along these ridge lines due to the enhanced as air flows up the mountainsides. Although there wasn't a lot of movement of air here, a lot of these cells really kind of built in place. But nevertheless, you have these peaks that as the sun beats down on them, they collect the heating of the day. And as that morning turns into afternoon, we can get these buildups all around the mountain peaks in those areas. So terrain really has a significant impact. And they weren't building enough to be covered by a convective sigmet because they're just not sigmet level convection at this point in time. So as a result, there was really no advisories. There was a graphical airmet, G airmet for icing, kind of right along the edge of the flight path. So he was right on the edge of that. But G airmets are really for non-convective icing, and this was more of a convective kind of flavor.
So relative to that airmet, You think there might have been a better route option for him rather than just flying direct to Las Vegas?
Yeah, I think so. I think in this particular case, of course, we always say hindsight is 20/20, but this particular case, it would have been better to head left, and that would be a southerly path, and that would have put him into an area where there would not have been this area of building cumulus clouds, and been more in a situation where there was definitely some, let's say, the cloudiness in that particular region was a lot less, and there was not any kind of growth. He was kind of right on the edge of this boundary of where you saw a lot of convection. If you looked at the convective outlooks from the Storm Prediction Center, again, he was following right along the edge of that. Had I seen that particular element, I would have definitely made a more southerly flight path out of his departure airport before heading west towards Las Vegas.
Now, you had sent over a cloud phase chart that showed SLW cloud and LW cloud in that area. Tell us what that means.
When you start getting into looking at various different applications, like this particular one's called the GDCP, or ghost-derived cloud products, they really look at what's happening with the temperature aloft. And specifically, anytime that the temperatures are on the warmer side of subfreezing, that's at minus 15 or warmer, you're going to see in this particular product, it's going to show a baby blue color, which basically identifies that at least in the tops of the clouds, you've got all super cool liquid water and no other ice crystals, or it's not glaciated near the top. You have basically liquid water in those sub-freezing clouds. And essentially, if the clouds are not that cold on the top, it'll just be regular old liquid water and not super cooled. So in this particular case, when you looked at picture, there was a really large area of this baby blue color. And that really tells you that anywhere in that region, let's say to the north and west of the route, would have put the pilot into a situation where they would not have been able to get out of this icing scenario unless they climbed to a significant height. I think the tops in this area range from anywhere from 14 to 17,000 feet, but cumulus clouds are kind of weird in the sense that you can pass by one that's 10,000 foot top, and the next one is 14, and the next one is 18. All in the same general vicinity. So it's really hard to forecast this stuff. And certainly the forecasters don't even try to forecast this kind of a thing. The various different icing tools, like the current and forecast icing products, were pretty spot on overall with this. They were showing a very cellular-like structure in terms of the icing intensity, which again is very similar to what you would see with a NexRad image of a cellular structure when you get convection going. And so this was showing very well that definitely some moderate, even some heavy icing in certain spots. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's enough information to tell you that, hey, this is an area you're not going to want to traverse unless you're really, really high, or you take another route.
So talk a little bit more about the CIP and the colors are used, and kind of what this shows pilots when they bring it up.
Yeah, so the current icing product is an analysis in the recent past. So it's usually at the top of every hour, it's run, and at that point in time, it's usually available about 20 minutes after the hour. So when you get it, it's about 20 minutes old, but it's the closest that you have to representing the icing scenario, if you will, for that region. So it uses intensities that are very familiar to pilots, such as trace, light, moderate. They don't use severe because severe is reserved for how the airplane reacts to those meteorological conditions, not the meteorological conditions themselves. So as a result of that, they use the term heavy instead. So anytime the algorithm for the current icing product picks up on some really juicy clouds with some lift going on, and it's using satellite imagery like we're looking at for this particular accident, and it's looking at surface observations, it's looking at NexRad, it's even looking at pilot reports that you and I report for icing, in addition to lightning for that deep convection. So it's looking at observational data and putting all that together and providing a good analysis overall. So it's really hard to beat in terms of a good icing diagnostic. And the great thing about this is that all forms of icing, whether it's convective or non-convective, are going to be shown by the current icing product.
Now, I talked with a pilot who listens to this show and contacted me after last week's episode. He had flown the same flight, was about 60 miles behind the accident pilot. And he said that after he entered a cloud when he was at 14,000 feet, initially he was picking up light rime, but then when he next looked down about 5 minutes later, He'd picked up about a quarter inch of clear ice within less than 5 minutes. What does that tell you about what was going on in that cloud?
Same kind of thing. I think, with cumulus clouds, you can get the full range. Normally, every cumulus cloud that's at temperatures below freezing, you almost always pick up some kind of light or trace icing, even really small clouds. But when you start getting deeper and deeper clouds, it's not unusual to pick up the heavier ice. And clear ice makes a lot of sense in this particular case because the temperatures were on the warmer side of the spectrum, and the drops in cumulus clouds tend to be bigger, 50 microns or greater. And if you understand what a micron is, basically a human hair is about 100 microns in diameter. So when you get to 50 microns in diameter of these drops, you're about the half the size of human hair. And no aircraft is certificated, even those with ice protection systems, to fly in that kind of environment. So we're really dealing with a large drop icing scenario here. And as a result of that, it doesn't surprise me with what the other pilot was suggesting, that you went from an area that was fairly benign, maybe got into a cloud that was in a dissipating state, or maybe not into a full growth state, to another cloud that was much, much more intense. Because ultimately, the other aspect of this is to look at the temperature and the height of the cloud base, because when you have really warm air, you can evaporate a lot more moisture into that air, and as a result, that moisture can condense out a lot more rich in terms of the overall liquid water content in those clouds. So these cumulus clouds have larger drops, which tend to take longer to freeze and run back, and also the simple fact that you're dealing with a situation where you tend to have higher liquid water content, so there's more stuff. That sponge is bigger, if you will, and when that cumulus cloud is growing and condensing out all this moisture, it's like you're wringing out the sponge.
So do you have any information on what the cloud-based temperatures might have been that day?
Yeah, the cloud-based temperatures were above freezing in this particular case, but just slightly above freezing. So we're dealing with a 15-degree drop from the temperature in terms of that rising air. So that's a pretty warm scenario as far as icing goes. And some of the worst icing reports I've ever gotten from some of my customers have been not during the wintertime when you think about most ice. It was during the summertime events when they tried to work their way through this. And I've actually run into this myself, where I tried to outclimb a cumulus cloud similar to this situation. Fortunately, I was not in the mountainous areas, and my reaction to that was just push the nose over, tell ATC that I can no longer climb in this situation, and end up getting below the freezing level, and everything started to go away. So lowering the nose and getting below that freezing level into warmer temperatures was the right solution. That's really hard in mountainous areas, just because you've got those mountains nearby, and descending may put you in a situation where you're kind of flirting with disaster with those mountain peaks.
Well, in that range of mountains that he was just coming up along, what kind of impact is that going to have on lifting action and resulting ice?
Yeah, most of the cases you're going to see an enhancement in those areas, especially if you have an area of weather that's kind of moving and getting lift. You're basically wringing out that sponge on the upwind side of that mountain. So the windward side of the mountain is where you're going to see that. And in a lot of mountain ranges, actually the leeward side of the mountain range are dry, because most of the precipitation falls out on that windward side. And as a result of that, it tends to be where you see the most significant icing occurring on that particular side. So you may enter into a cloud, let's say, it might be kind of straddling the mountain top, and the first piece of it you enter into might be pretty dry overall, but then you all of a sudden get onto the windward side of that mountain and you find yourself in a lot more serious icing. So the windward side is where you have the updraft or the lift going on. So you want to make sure you're on the leeward side. So that's the opposite side. So if you have winds that's going from west to east over a mountain range, you don't want to be on the western side. You want to be on the eastern side of that mountain.
Okay. So you're saying essentially that it's wrung out the moisture on the western side and along the tops of the mountains. And then as you get further toward the leeward side, further east, then you're going to have less moisture there.
That's correct. In fact, also it depends on how the mountains themselves are oriented in terms of a lot of very steep faces to mountains can also create more lift. So in the east here where I live, the Appalachian Mountains tend to be more rolling hills. Yeah, there's a few peaks here and there that have some pretty good faces to them in terms of steepness, but that also will affect things, and not only icing, but mountain wave activity as well.
So if this pilot didn't have oxygen, and I'm guessing he didn't, but I don't know for sure, what kind of options does he have at 14,000 feet as he's running into severe icing?
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, if I got myself into that situation, everything's about airspeed. You don't want to continue to climb. Anytime you have your angle of attack, a much higher angle of attack, if you look at all the icing incidents or accidents that occur, they generally occur when you have a high angle of attack. So you need to reduce that as quickly as possible. And then if you can descend down to below temperatures that are above freezing, so you want to descend to temperatures where it's much warmer, that's going to almost guarantee you'll get out of the icing. You're not going to be climbing because you're now, number one, you're in a situation where climb is going to put you potentially in the tops, even higher in the tops, where typically in these kind of clouds, the icing is worse. The best thing to do is to try to turn outside and get out of the cloud. The interesting thing about cumulus clouds, a lot of times you can be through them in a matter of 30 seconds or a minute, but this was a pretty large area, and he was kind of orienting himself along kind of a row of clouds, if you will, based on what I see on the satellite image. So in some cases, the best thing to do is to do a 180 and get back outside the cloud if you can. I mean, obviously that's harder. It's easier said than done, but that may be the quickest way out.
So to kind of sum it up, what do you think are some of the key takeaways that pilots should have related to icing?
I think the overall situation here is simply that many of us could fall into this kind of a trap. Having a good pre-flight and understanding the threats before you depart is really the key to this. I always say that your pre-flight analysis should be where you make your mistakes and where you find your mistakes. You don't want to find those mistakes when you're up in the air. And don't blame the simple fact that, hey, there was no forecast for icing, so therefore it wasn't my fault that I ran into ice. You understand that there's not a forecast that's going to cover every situation. Learning the environment, looking at all the tools, and being confident. So I can teach you, give you a lot of knowledge, and I can give you a lot of resources, all the different websites out there, but it's hard for me to really teach you how to be confident in your decision making. And so the goal here is to do as much as you can pre-flight, and then hopefully your in-flight situation will be boring, and that's the goal. Have all the excitement before you take off, and little or no excitement when you're flying.
That's what I like, is little excitement when I'm flying. I like to keep those flights boring. So tell us, how do people find your book and find out more about Scott Dennstaedt?
Well, you can go to pilotweatherbook.com. That's pilotweatherbook.com. Sell a soft cover and an ebook as well, and there's a combo deal which will save you some money there. Or you can come to my website at avwxworkshops, ending in an S.com. So it's avwxworkshops.com.
Scott, thanks so much for your time today.
Not a problem, Max.
Well, Scott raises a good point, which is that you need to do a thorough briefing, especially if there's any chance of icing. And if you do decide to go, you have to have a plan ahead of time for how you're going to escape the ice. And sometimes the best route isn't the direct route to your destination. Now let's talk a little bit about the differences between the original TKS system and the FIKI systems on the Cirrus SR22. Cirrus introduced the original TKS system late in 2002. It carries 3 gallons of an ethylene glycol-based fluid that has a freezing point that's below minus 70 degrees. And when it's pumped out across the wings and the tail, it strongly resists the formation of ice on those surfaces. So you want to turn the system on before you pick up ice. If you wait until after you pick up ice, it will still eventually remove the ice, but it's going to take much longer to do that. To get the fluid to cover the airplane, narrow titanium panels are mounted along the leading edge of the wing and the horizontal stabilizer. These panels have thousands of laser-drilled holes, each about the size of a human hair. Now, there's a single pump that sends fluid through what are essentially sponges behind each of the panels, which then feed the fluid through the holes in the panel. The fluid then coats the wings and the tail, and in addition, there's a slinger ring which is used to prevent ice from forming on the propeller. This original TKS system has both a normal and a high setting, and the amount of time the fluid will last depends upon the version. Early versions lasted 60 minutes on the normal setting and just 30 minutes on the high setting. A later version lasted 90 minutes and 45 minutes respectively. And by the way, this system is only for inadvertent icing protection. That is, legally, you cannot use it to fly in known icing conditions. And then in 2009, Cirrus introduced the more robust Fiki version of the system. It adds a number of features, including another TKS panel that's mounted on the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer. It also includes ice lights that illuminate both wings and the horizontal stabilizer, and that makes it easier in low-light conditions to see if you're picking up ice. It also includes a heated stall transducer so that your stall horn will still work in icing conditions. Now, that heater is operated by the pitot heat switch, and there's a 45-second limitation on operating that switch on the ground so that you don't overheat and damage the stall sensor. There's also a TKS sprayer for the windshield, and the system has a backup pump so that if the one pump in the original system fails, the Fiki system will still work. Now, that system also carries a total of 8 gallons of TKS fluid, and that's nearly triple the amount of the original system. The Fiki system also has gauges on the MFD so that you can see how much fluid you have remaining. Now, the earlier system had no gauges at all, so unless you had some kind of calibrated string to drop into the tank, you really didn't know how much fluid you had unless it was completely full. Now, in the Fiki system, the aircraft computers can also dynamically adjust the stall speed that's displayed on the PFD based on the aircraft's weight, density, altitude, and load factor. By the way, I want to note that if you land with any ice on the wings, you're limited to a 50% flap setting in the SR22. There's also an extensive pre-flighting of the Fiki system, and that is required. You have to do it if you're going to launch into conditions where icing is possible. Among other things, you have to run the system until fluid can be seen leaking out through the entire length of all of the panels. Also, that process has to be done at least every 30 days. Otherwise, those sponges behind the panels, well, they can dry out. And doing this kind of pre-flight assures that once you're in flight, you'll be getting protection on the wings almost immediately after turning the system on, rather than having to wait for perhaps several minutes while you're potentially accumulating ice that will then be later hard to remove once the system starts pumping fluid through the panels. Now let's talk about tailplane stalls. These are a relatively rare form of stall that's totally different than the stalls you normally practice, and it's most likely to occur in icing conditions. And my guess is that's the kind of stall that occurred on my client's airplane as he was flying in ice in Utah. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the lifting force of a wing, which is mostly straight up when you're flying level at cruise speeds, so it provides an upward lifting force. By contrast, the horizontal stabilizer is designed to be an inverted wing, and it provides a downward lifting force to the tail. And that's needed because an aircraft's center of gravity is usually located in front of the wing's lifting force. And if the wing were the only source of lift, it would raise the back end of the aircraft up and point the nose of the aircraft down toward the ground. To prevent that, the tail has to have a downward force that keeps the plane level by holding the tail down and preventing it from going up. Now, an important thing to know about icing is that it forms first around small radius objects. So, for example, icing will form around an antenna sooner than it will form on the wing. And likewise, the tail has a pretty small leading edge compared to the wing, so ice will form on the horizontal stabilizer sooner than it will form on the wing. So when you're looking for ice, don't just look at the wings, but turn around and look behind you at the tail as well. Now, as ice contaminates the leading edge of the horizontal stab, you may no longer have laminar airflow over the stabilizer, and you can get into a situation where airflow is so disrupted and moving it away from the elevator that you could find that moving the elevator results in no response from the airplane. That would be pretty scary to be in that situation. Now, NASA has studied tailplane stalls, and here are some of the warning signs they found of an impending tailplane stall. One is lightening of the controls, and sometimes the stick will actually feel lighter in the forward direction. So as you push forward, you get relatively little resistance. As you pull back, you feel a stronger force. 2 would be difficulty trimming of the airplane. 3 is the onset of pilot-induced oscillations. So as you're pitching forward and backwards, you may cause the aircraft to pitch up and down. And finally, 4 is buffeting in the controls. That is, the control stick itself or the control yoke is moving in and out on its own accord, not the airframe. So that would be pretty scary to see that thing moving in and out. Now, when the tail does stall, the method of stall recovery is virtually the opposite of the stalls we practice in flight training. If the wing stalls, we push the yoke forward, add full power, and then pitch for climb. But if the tail stalls, you need to pull back on the yoke and reduce the power. And if you were using flaps prior to the stall, you need to raise the flaps. Now, by the way, lowering the flaps increases the chance of a tailplane stall. That's because as you add flaps, the center of lift on the wing moves further aft away from the center of gravity. and to keep the aerodynamic forces balanced, the tail then has to work harder, creating even more downward force. Also, lowering the flaps increases the downwash of air coming off the wings, and that air then strikes the tail at a more downward angle, effectively increasing the angle of attack of the horizontal stabilizer and putting you closer to the critical angle where the tail will stall. Now, when a tail stalls, the nose will pitch down sharply and the aircraft will speed up quickly. Now, my friend John Fiskus of the Flight Academy in Washington State did a simulation of a tailplane stall after an SR22 crashed after icing up near Squaw Valley Ski Resort in 2005. In that case, the airplane entered icing and the parachute separated from the aircraft after it was deployed at a speed estimated at 270 knots, which is about twice the maximum parachute deployment speed listed in the POH. What John found in the simulation was that when lift was removed from the tail, the aircraft pitched down about 20 degrees and exceeded VNE, the never exceed speed of 201 knots, in about 5 seconds. And that brings us to why the CAPS parachute didn't save my client in this most recent accident. If the pilot experienced severe icing, which is what the data suggest, it's quite likely he experienced a tailplane stall. Now, imagine that you're in IMC and you've been bouncing around in the updrafts and downdrafts you find in a cumulus cloud. If the tail stalls and the nose pitches down, you're going to rise up in your seat against your seatbelt. But if you encounter a big downdraft, you're also going to be rising up in your seat against your seatbelt. So for the first few seconds after a tailplane stall, it might not be obvious that the aircraft stalled. You might just think that you'd hit yet another downdraft and that the nose happened to be lower than usual in this downdraft. And if you've reached 200 knots in 5 seconds, you've just lost your opportunity to use the CAPS parachute. So in this particular case, whether the pilot pulled the parachute or not, it really wouldn't matter because it's not going to work at those high speeds. Unless the pilot was able to figure out that he was in a tailplane stall, perform the recovery steps, which are the opposite of a typical stall, get the aircraft under control, and the speed below 187 knots, which is the highest speed at which the CAPS parachute has been successfully deployed, and then use the parachute. In that situation, yes, it could have saved him, but you can see there's a pretty long string of events that has to happen correctly first. So as a result of this accident, my thinking on using the parachute in icing accidents has totally changed. First, I now have a better appreciation of just how serious moderate and severe icing can be, and I would now be more aggressive about exiting icing when it first starts to occur. In fact, if needed, I wouldn't hesitate to violate the FAA's oxygen rules because severe icing is an emergency, and the FAA has given us that authority to violate any rule if needed during an emergency. In fact, it's so important, they put that rule right up in front. It's 91.3, and it says, in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So if climbing above 14,000 feet without oxygen were my only option in severe icing, I would definitely do that. And I now realize that it may make sense to pull the parachute before the airplane has a tailplane stall. So my new plan is if an aircraft slows to 95 knots in severe icing and I'm not out of the cloud and I'm unable to descend because of terrain, I'm going to pull the parachute. Because if I wait until after a tailplane stall, it may be too late to pull the parachute. Now, let me mention a good resource for all Cirrus pilots, or for all pilots for that matter, and that's the Icing Awareness course that's available for $50 in the Cirrus Learning Portal at cirrusapproach.com. If you're flying an SR22 with Fiki, you're actually required to take that course before flying in icing conditions, and you have to take it again every 2 years, because you're going to learn a lot about icing. And you'll also learn about the capabilities available in a Fiki version of the SR22. But I'm also thinking now that pilots flying any version of a Cirrus should also take the course, because you're going to learn a lot about icing, and you'll learn about the capabilities available in a Fiki version of the SR22. And maybe after taking the course, you might just decide you need to upgrade to a Fiki version of the aircraft, or at least rent one anytime you're contemplating a flight where there's any chance of encountering icing conditions. So in summary, we lost a good pilot who possibly underestimated the seriousness of the situation he was in. Chris, I'm going to miss you, but hopefully telling your story will save some other pilots from an icing accident. And coming up next, listener feedback right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Bill Ayers up in the Washington State area. He says, excellent advice with the 8 lessons in episode 105 regarding single points of failure. Over the years, I think I've had as many attitude indicators fail as vacuum pumps. I installed a backup electric attitude indicator, which has a standby battery, and so now have 2 vacuum pumps, 2 alternators, and 2 attitude indicators, plus another vacuum attitude indicator on the co-pilot side. Also a handheld radio with an external antenna. Belt and suspenders approach to my Malibu for all the IMC in the Pacific Northwest. Keep up the great work, Bill. Thanks so much, Bill. And let's see, here's from Patreon supporter Jeff Bowering. He said, just enjoyed episode 107 on the commute home. Really enjoy and got a lot out of your broadcast. In this episode, you recommend the figure 8 approach while descending with an engine failure. It's great advice, and it's the way I was taught during the private training in the early 1990s. You mentioned that a benefit is that you can always make a quick turn to the runway, but it's worth mentioning that there's a right way and a wrong way to fly the figure 8. One way always has the plane turning such that the runway passes through the 12 o'clock position, while the other would have the runway at 6 o'clock at the far ends of each loop of the 8. The former is clearly best. Count me in as a Patreon supporter. Your content is well worth it. And yes, just to clarify that if you were flying a straight-in approach to the runway, imagine passing through a figure 8 where one loop is on your left and one loop is on your right. And you would pass through the middle of those 2 loops, and you would fly that figure 8 that I've just described. So one loop is on the left side of the runway, one loop is on the right side of the runway. And you wouldn't make exactly back-to-back 360s. When you came to the crossing point that's lined up with the center line of the runway, you would never turn more than about 45 degrees away from perpendicular. Way you're never pointed completely at 6 o'clock away from the runway. Here's an email from Frederick in Arizona. Max wanted to thank you for an excellent podcast. I followed it faithfully over the past year and always look out for the next one. Also wanted to let you know that your podcast was quite helpful in getting ready for my private pilot check ride, which I passed last week. So congratulations to you, Frederick. That's really cool. And let's see, from Jay up in Oregon, he says, regarding episode 103, the CAPS parachute pull over water, I flew helicopters over the Gulf of Mexico and always wore my flotation device. I can't imagine flying over water without it, despite how uncomfortable it felt in the summer with no air conditioning in the aircraft. We kept our portable personal locator device strapped into a pocket of the vest along with a water dye marker, signal mirror, bag to climb into to help prevent heat loss and deter sharks apparently, and an emergency strobe light. I'd recommend a similar setup. Keep it on your body to make sure you have it when exiting your aircraft, which may be upside down in the water. Thanks so much for that. And here's an email from Catherine Cavagnaro. She's a brand new Patreon supporter, and you probably have read some of her work in AOPA Pilot magazine. She says, I always recommend to each instrument rating or CFII candidate your IFR GPS books as terrific references, telling them that I cannot pick my copy up without learning something I didn't know before or forgot. At the end of a recent practical exam, by the way, she's an examiner, I gave a scenario designed to discuss the effects of carbon monoxide. The applicant said, oh, I just heard a great podcast on this topic. We both said, aviation news talk at the same time, and I laughed. I told him, he's the one who wrote the book. Well, thanks so much for that, Catherine, and looking forward to seeing you at the AOPA fly-in that's going to be coming up later this month. I know we're both speakers there. And hey, I want to get started with my weekend, so I'm going to wrap this up by saying if you're interested in buying any model of Cirrus aircraft or jet, or are interested in flight training in one, please contact me today. Just pick up the phone. It's a free call, free consultation. In some cases, I can also arrange a free demo flight for you. And I'm always happy to talk with you about the ins and outs of buying new versus used. Just pick up the phone, call me 650-967-2500, or go out to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the website. And that's also the place where you can leave listener questions or give us any feedback at all. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And here's one more thing that I really want to ask for your help with. The single biggest challenge I face with this show is finding new listeners. But a lot of them come from people like you telling your friends about the show. And if your friends don't know what a podcast is, well, it's easy. Just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app for iOS and Android. Just go out into the App Store and search for Aviation News Talk, just like you would for any other app. And of course, those apps are free. Also, check out our Patreon site. Consider becoming a supporter. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.